Thank you to the gentlewoman from Michigan. Mr. Speaker, we're going to actually try something, and these are always those moments where if you don't like something, it's fairly thick. We're going to do lots of demographics. If you don't enjoy that sort of stuff, don't watch this. I'm going to try to lay out a bit of an argument of the headwinds we're facing as a country, as a society. I'm also going to point out that we're still dramatically better off than much of the actually all the industrialized world, and we've done it better over the last couple decades than the rest of the industrialized world. But you gotta understand what's coming, and there'll be a couple examples here where we can take a look and see what's happening in Japan, and is that a foreshadowing of some of our demographics. But there's something, it's once again, it's a chip on my shoulder. As I listen to my brothers and sisters from the left, I just need them to step up and admit that in the last 2 years, Americans are poorer. You know, they'll get up behind the microphone and attack Republicans for trying to grow the economy, for trying to provide opportunities. Matter of fact, a couple minutes ago in the 1-minute speeches, we had a member of the left get up and talk about supply-side economics. I'm going, where have you been the last couple of years of my life? You're now actually stealing our language. If you are a working man and women in this country, your purchasing power of your paycheck, you are poorer today than the day Joe Biden was elected. It's math. And so if you want to understand why so many Americans are cranky, are dour, are just, in some ways, just very dark on what the future looks like, it's because every day they go into a grocery store or to work or this, and they realize they're poorer today than they were a couple years ago. Where's the empathy? But also, where's the goal to grow where we can actually make up for the wages not keeping up anything close to what inflation is? So we're going to actually start to walk through. I have a lot of boards. I'm going to do some of these very, very fast. If there's a staffer or someone out there watching, because I try to explain to people, the room is substantially empty. It's supposed to be. The House is done with its legislative work. But there's thousands of people on this campus and around Washington, D.C. and around the country who are working for members of Congress who may have this idiot, me, on their television trying to talk to them about economics and how we make America prosperous again. So let's actually do some of the positives. Something we don't tell each other enough. If you actually look at the economic conditions, go ahead and set that one right there. The economic conditions of per capita, and you actually look at it from 1980 till today, you do realize the United States has done dramatically better than the rest of the industrialized world. We're up, if you actually sort of adjust all the currencies to the same purchasing power, per capita income for the United States is around $70,000 per worker in this country. But you take a look at our competitors. The next best one is all of Western Europe. They're around 46,000. Do understand the brain trust around here that often comes in, we should be more like Western Europe. You want us to give up that much? That much of our economic prosperity? We are better. We are more prosperous. We are more actually innovative. And we're losing it. It is this prosperity that many of us are behind these mics trying to defend. This is what we're trying to defend in our policy sets. And I have another way to try to explain this. Average income in the U.S. continues to be significantly higher than other countries. And I think on this one I use Japan and Western Europe. Our per capita income, if you actually look over, in 1990, we were about 24% per capita income higher than Western Europe. Today, we're about 30%. We still outgrew them. But I want you to take a look at Japan, and this is one of the examples we're going to use in here, what happens when you have that demographic headwind, when you're running out of actually workers. 1980, we had about a 17%. To the plus side, healthier incomes than Japan in 1980. Today, it's 54%. And Japan didn't actually shrink in their income. We grew so much more than Japan and obviously Western Europe. Pat ourselves on the back and then get back to work, because we are going to lose this marginal prosperity with many of the policies I'm seeing happening from this administration, from what the Democrats did to us over the last couple of years, and now we need to walk through the headwind of what's really going on in America. A couple points of reference, and we went back and vetted the number. In about 18 years, the United States has more deaths than births. In 18 years, more deaths than births. And that's actually with current sort of immigration models. So if you walk through this, you're not a dying society, but you're fading. Now, there's ways you make that up. You know, in country after country after country have tried to change their what we call fertility rates, and we're going to do geeky stuff here. I think there's one country, it may be Hungary, I think if you have the third child, they give you a house, and it's barely adjusted the country's fertility rates. You need to accept this is across the industrialized world. Prosperity actually is sort of the opposite of Malthusians, opposite of the idiots that wrote things like the population bomb back in the late 60s. They were wrong. The only thing Ehrlich got right was maybe the spelling of his name on his book in 1968, but the left still worships him. Prosperity actually leads to delayed marriages, to less fertility. And we're going to talk about that, but we're also going to touch on some other things that we could affect by policy. And I'm going to step out on a limb. I'm going to talk about some things that, you know, a politician gets himself in trouble for, but it's math and it's the truth. We got a real problem with young males. And it's blowing off the pages in the statistics. So let's go see how uncomfortable we can make each other, but it's math, and the math always wins. And I don't, and Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, I hope, I'm trying not to curse, but I don't give a darn if it hurts your feelings. We got to embrace and deal with the facts. So let's do some facts. Percentage of people 65 and over relative to the number of people we have when we say 25 to 64. So 25, 64 is what we mean when we say prime working age populations. That's actually our productive populations. Now, I actually believe in today's world, I intend never to retire because I'm also crazy. I'm 61 and I have a 9-month-old. And yes, my wife is exactly my age. I'm pathologically optimistic. So people like me are never retiring. But the reality of it is what we see in our society is my prime working age population is shrinking where my over 65 population is exploding. And we call it, what was the term? Baby boomers. It's like Congress completely forgot there were baby boomers. But you look at this chart, and we're here in the inflection years, where the growth of our population that is 65 and older is just growing incredibly. And understand, in a couple decades, if you say my ratio of prime age workers compared to my population that's 65 and older, we get as high as 46%. 46% will be 65 and older compared to prime age. Grow your economy when almost half your population is 65 and older compared to your working population. And yes, that number skews out under 18 for a couple other reasons, and some of that's because of fertility and some other things trying to calculate it. That type of ratio, you need to think through how do you design economic incentives for productivity. What are you willing to automate? Are you going to run around and be terrified of chat AIs and other things that may add a huge productivity spike or allow an individual worker to be much more productive? This place has to stop being terrified of technology, because without it, we're going to be buried. Here's another slide, basically in some ways saying the same thing. By 2042, so how many years is that? 19 years. Population growth will be driven entirely by net immigration, basically saying in about 18 years, remember, we're going to have more deaths than births. Any population change we're having at the time will be from immigration. Are we going to ever update our immigration codes so saying we want immigration that maximizes vitality for the country? You're going to go fixate more on a talent-based immigration system than, I don't have a more polite way to say this, when you have an open border like Arizona, and come down to the border sometime with me, and you have migration of poverty. Wonderful people, I'm sure that, they're God's children, but the fact of the matter, I got to figure out a way to pay for Medicare and Social Security. I need highly productive populations to have the multiplier effect in the economy. The math will win. And I know this chart, this one's a little hard to read. The only adult population group expected to decrease past 2485 will be my prime working age. Our working population, our productive population, and from the economic terms, is shrinking. We get about a decade out and we roll. We begin to shrink. Another way, and this one's a little easier to understand, the prime working age population is the only age group. The prime working age population is the only age group expected to decline in the long run. And you start to see this, and I'm going to show you some slides of what this means to economic growth. So part of the argument I'm making here is we're fighting over the debt ceiling and what the budgets look like and what the long-term projections are. Remember, I've been to this floor, heaven knows how many times over the last few years, saying between today and 30 years from now, 100% of the borrowing. So we're expecting now, about 128 trillion of borrowing in that 30-year. 100% of that borrowing is the shortfall of Medicare. Remember, 3/4 of Medicare comes from the general fund, and the Medicare Part A trust fund is going to be empty in about, 6 years? And the other part, the other 25% of that $128 trillion of borrowing will be if we backfill Social Security. And you all saw, because I know all this place ran out, got a copy of the Medicare Social Security actuary report that came out 3 weeks ago that basically said we lost another year. It's not 10 years, it's now like 9 years. Social Security Trust Fund is gone. And at that moment, if we do not fix Social Security, we double senior poverty. And what did the president do in that podium when we had the State of the Union? He basically made talking about fixing Social Security toxic because it was a better campaign issue than a moral one. All right, a little bit more fun with math. An increase, large share of births, or an increasingly large share of births are happening to women 30 and over. Why would you show this slide? It's basically when we're doing fertility curves, when your population, you have older parents, they have fewer children. And look, I'm one of these. I have 2 kids and I'm in my early 60s with my wife. Now we're an outlier, there were other health issues and other things. But this is actually becoming much more common, that as we wait for prosperity, it's so hard to start a family, it's so hard to find a spouse, it's so hard in the economics, particularly with what's happened the last 2 years, where if you're that working person and you want to get married, but you're poorer today. Remember, family formation is a derivative of a couple things. It's who graduates schools and your ability to find stable employment, to have economic growth. Most people will not enter into family formation until you start to have that level of stability. And the last couple of years, with the policies here, we're willing to give out stunning amounts of money to green energy, to this, to that, to whatever favorite groups, subsidize really rich people to go buy battery walls. And we functionally subsidize people not to actually participate in the labor force. So another one, just a basically, and this is where it gets uncomfortable, but the math is the math is the math. And if we don't start to think about it, we're avoiding a really uncomfortable subject. Men's participation has fallen 19%. Now, I know this is like over the last 70 years, but something's going on in our society. And we've brought in an expert a couple of years ago, and the conversation was fascinating. It was a professor from one of the Ivy Leagues, and she was saying, look, we don't know if some of it's drugs, though we expect that. We don't know if some of it's video games. We don't know if it's also, and there were questions that, how many young men particularly, are put in hyperactive drugs during their adolescent years, other things. I mean, we just don't know, but we do know we have a crisis of young males coming back into society, and we need them. We need their participation for more than just their tax revenues from their labor. A healthy society is one that has the vitality where everyone is sort of loved and participates in the economy and has opportunity. And with that comes sort of the American dream of family formation and other things. But the numbers gotten ugly. Total 13% of prime age males are not working. Remember, I just walked you through some of the prime age male calculations. Or what that demographic was. 13% of the males in that group are not participating in the economy. You want an economic pop? I can fix things in the tax code. I can do some incredible things here with the Ways and Means Committee and the members here that actually care about economics to incentivize investments. But I also have a moral issue of I have a huge portion of my society that have dropped out. We need to understand why, and we need to bring them back. If not for economic reasons, just for basic humanity. And so you actually see, and we've been trying to dive into this to understand, okay, here is functionally, we're getting right up against the pandemic, but the new baseline is dramatically below where we were before. Male labor force participation. And it just continues to steadily decline. This is a problem. I can't make much of the math work in the out years. So I get members here who say, David, give me a plan to balance in 10 years. Do understand, I can balance. We could build a plan. As we could all come together and balance in 10 years. Of course, the next day we'd be out of balance. In 9 budget years, and I've said this, and this seems to be the single thing I say that upsets more people around here than anything. So let's do it slowly. In 9 budget years, according to CBO's report from 6 weeks ago, you can get rid of every dime of the military. You can get rid of every dime of the rest of what we call discretionary. That's the FBI, the military, the Park Service, the State Department, the White House, the Supreme Court. It's all gone. Everything you think is discretionary. In 9 budget years, it's all gone. There's no discretionary. You still have to borrow a couple $100 billion to have enough cash flow to cover Medicare, enough cash flow to cover veterans benefits. And we haven't actually calculated in the fact that the actuaries from the Social Security Medicare just removed a year of actuarial life. So it may be much worse because our math before was the very next year, so that 10 budget years, it's not a couple $100 billion you have to borrow. It may be several $100 billion you have to borrow if you were to backfill Social Security. These are demographic. Is that Republican or Democrat? It's a bit of both. But the fact of the matter is the primary driver of our debt is demographics. We got old as a society. And this place needs to be maniacally fixated on growth, on efficiencies, on adopting the technologies that make healthcare and other things less expensive but more accessible. If we don't do this, this math gets really ugly really fast. This is not something, we're not talking about something 20 years from now. We're talking about something, how many of you expect to still be with us in 9 years? That's what we're talking about. And you start to see things of this. So this is actually one of the things that's going on, and the number is actually worse. This is just the only chart we have that we've vetted. The number of males and females which are entering sort of our university world, they pretty much entered about the same, except graduation rates. Males are only about 40% are graduating, and I think the number now is in the high 30s. It rolled over again over the last couple of years. Females, God bless them, we're seeing around 60% of those are graduating. It's wonderful. But this number between there is actually a really uncomfortable conversation. It's called functionally family formation gap. How many that have succeeded, you got your bachelor's degree, you got your master's degree, you went through the university process, you've graduated. What's the population of prospective spouses? Something's going on in our society where we were trying to understand why are there so few family formation, and some of the demographers that responded to our question said, you got a problem. You got lots of success in females making it through college systems, university systems, and males. We have some universities where females are graduating at twice the rate. And that differential, because how much of this population is comfortable marrying someone who also did not graduate? And that's a tough thing. And we don't talk about things like here, but it's at such sizable numbers now. We're actually seeing it in our economic data. So let's see, what else can we produce that actually makes us uncomfortable? This is basically the same thing we just talked about, actually broken out by genders. But this trend, this chart ends in 2020. It's actually gotten worse in the last couple of years. But this is not a new trend. This has been going on for we've been tracking it for about the last 15 years. And we actually have been also trying to understand what happens because of some of these societal factors, the fact that the economics of, government has pumped in lots of money, done all these things, but people are poor because they set off inflation with much of the economic policies and what the Fed did, but also the Inflation Reduction Act and all these other things where we just dumped money back into society and won't take responsibility for setting off inflation, to my brothers and sisters on the left. But with those economic headwinds, you're actually seeing other data of the delays in marriage formation or household formations. And with that, we're recalculating how many children we expect to have in America. Understand, half the states in the United States today have more deaths than births. Half the states today have more deaths than births. And as a country in total, in 18 years, we'll have more deaths than births. By 2042, deaths are projected to exceed births in CBO's population growth model, and this one's already out of date. So even CBO has been putting this out. Now, the reason I keep showing these demographic slides is, do you all remember your high school economics class? Stable populations or growing populations have the ability to have economic expansion, what we call, I don't want to geek out too much. It's hard to have that domestic gross product expanding and expanding unless you have populations to take the jobs, or you're willing to do tax and regulatory code changes like a number of the countries that compete against. I'm going to show you some of those slides in a moment, where they said, we can't get labor, we're going to incentivize robots. We're going to incentivize automation. And you're going to get people who go, well, what about the jobs? We don't have people. You have school districts all over America that the incoming kindergartners, first graders population is falling. The schools are going to have fewer kids. They're going to be closing schools. And then they look at you like, well, that makes me upset. We've been talking about this for, a quarter century, the falling fertility rates. And here's the punchline. And we worked really hard on this math. The Joint Economic Committee and some of the economists, some of the others, we spent weeks, because this is sort of one of those things you don't really find in the literature. But if I have a 1% decrease in my labor population, my labor growth. You lose 0.6% of GDP growth. If you had a 2%, you lose a point and 1.2. If you had a 5% decrease, which that's what some of these charts are talking about, in your labor force populations, in the out years, you're losing 3% of your GDP growth. Why this is important? How many of you all just saw that CBO just basically said, Congressional Budget Office just said, hey, we expect the next year, maybe a couple of years, the United States is only going to grow like at 1.2%. You're already seeing it in the math. Yet how many how many of us have gotten up behind these microphones and tried to explain, got to fix tax policy, got to fix regulatory policy, got to fix trade policy, got to fix immigration policy. We're not sure how to fix demographics. This one's really uncomfortable because almost no one understands it. And back to an oldie but a goodie. Why is this so important? This slide here is maybe 3 years old. It gets dramatically worse through the end of this decade. But once again, your government is an insurance company with an army. This is from the 2022 budget cycle. 71% of all of our spending is what we call mandatory. Some of that is earned. You earned your Social Security. You earned your Medicare. You earned your veterans benefits. Some things you get because you fell below a certain income. You get Medicaid, or you're part of a certain tribal population. The United States has a treaty obligation to meet. There are things out there. But the vast majority of this is what we would call earned benefits. So when you hear someone here, we say, oh, it's mandatory spending. We're not being disrespectful. You earned these. This is part of the societal contract. But you see over here, this wedge here, defense and non-defense discretionary. That's what you all think of government. In 9 budget years, every dime of this and part of the mandatory live on borrowed money. Now walk in my door and say, David, I demand you balance in 10. I can balance in 10. How much of the mandatory do you want us to cut? Because we can wipe out everything else. Also, you're prepared to live in a country without a defense? Of course, violation of the U.S. Constitution, but a lot of these folks don't seem to give a damn, care about what the U.S. Constitution says anymore, as long as it doesn't inconvenience them. And here's the one I get the most nasty emails about. What is the primary driver between today and 30 years from now? It's not the primary driver, it's 100%. 100% of the U.S. sovereign borrowing between today and 30 years from now, 75% of it is basically Medicare. 25% will be if we backfill Social Security in now, 8, 9 years because the trust fund's all empty. But what we allocate to the rest of the budget actually has cash in the bank. It's demographics. That's why we just spent the last half an hour going over what's happening demographically to your country. Getting old is not Republican or Democrat. How we react to it may be. And just one more time to understand 30 years, and this slide is already out of date. Social Security is on hard dollars. This is without the financing costs. If we backfill it, is $21 trillion short. Medicare, the part comes out of the general fund, which is 75% of all Medicare spending comes out of the general fund. Then there's this what we call Medicare Trust Fund, which the president talked about taxing, but it only produces, his new taxes only produce like $660 billion over 10 years, which is just a fraction of the spend, believe it or not. And that trust fund is functionally gone. So the Medicare shortfall is $48 trillion, and the financing cost of those two is $47 trillion added up, and the newest number, when we add it up, is closer to $128 trillion. Anyone getting the punchline here? We can fix Social Security. Of course, it would have been really helpful if the president had made it toxic If he had gone behind that microphone and said, I need our brothers and sisters on the right and left to do the moral thing, we care about our seniors, we're not going to allow at the end of this decade doubling of senior poverty, we're going to work together. But instead he made it toxic. But for Medicare, we need a revolution in the cost of health care. Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, how much time do I have left?
The gentleman has 26 minutes remaining.
If the Lord has mercy on us, I won't use all that time. Federal spending. Now, this is one I've never used on the floor. And it's been several years ago. I remember reading, actually, I think it might have been in The Economist magazine, which, and it was talking about in the 1970s, for every dollar spent on seniors, we spent $5 on young people. And that today, for every $5 we spend on seniors, we only spend $1 on young people. It's completely reversed. And this is basically what we're trying to say, is today, for folks 65 and older, and this is a 2015 number because it's the newest number I could find in the literature, we will spend $35,000 a year on seniors, and we'll spend $5,000 on young people. Just understand, that's what happens when your demographic curve changes. And we've updated this and we have vetted it, and this is as conservative. We were careful on this number. 1960, you had 5.1 workers for every one person on Social Security. Today, the math is, well, excuse me, in 2035, where we're basically heading, we believe it to be 2.3, and that number is assuming a stabilization of labor force participation. We have some other articles that say this actually falls down to only 2 people. So you and your partner, you and your spouse will have 1 person in retirement. But we're going to use 2.3, but understand those differentials. Social Security is a pay-as-you-go system. When you get the folks that say the lockbox, for years we had more workers than retirees were consuming. The trust fund built up, built up, built up, built up. No one stole your money. The cash came in and they loan it to Treasury. Treasury would give them special Treasury bills, just like you might take your own retirement account and say, I have some cash, I'm going to buy a Treasury bond. That's functionally what Social Security did. For the last couple of years, they've been cashing in those Treasury bonds. And that cashing in goes faster and faster and faster as the baby boomers are moving in. And that's what gets used up now, what is it, in about 8, 9 years. And at that moment, Social Security lives on its cash flow. So it'll be the cash flow from these workers, whatever FICA taxes they pay in, that's what will go out the door. That's why right now the best math is we expect a 23% cut. In that first year, the Social Security Trust Fund is expired. And then the next year it gets bigger, and the next year it gets bigger. And it breaks my heart because I think this is a moral obligation to fix this, except, once again, the left is going to use it as a political item for an election instead of a moral item of we're all going to come together and fix it. And for anyone out there, and I was surprised in these numbers, and this board I've used for years now, who says, just give me the money I put in. The United States government should grab that and run. But it's not, once again, it's not Social Security. Social Security, yeah, you get back every dime you put in, plus a little spiff. You would have made so much more. You would have been so much more prosperous if the left and these other groups hadn't stopped, what was it, 20 plus years ago, when there was a discussion of allowing younger workers to take a tiny sliver of that FICA tax and put it into the markets as a private account. We wouldn't be facing much of this crisis today. But the control freaks didn't want you to have any of your own money in the economy. So in Social Security, this is for a couple. And this slide is now a couple years old. For a couple, you'll pay about $625,000 in a lifetime. You're 40 quarters, you know, as you qualify and those things. But you're going to get back about $698. So what is that? About $72,000 spiff. But it's Medicare That's my mathematical problem. In Medicare, that couple will put in about $161,000 because the only Medicare actual FICA portion or tax you're actually paying is that Medicare Part A trust fund, which we just talked about is, okay, depending on the mix, can be up to about 40% of Medicare spend because it's really sort of the hospital portion. But the vast majority of Medicare spend comes out of the general fund. So you, as a couple, are going to put about $161,000 in your lifetime taxes into Medicare. You're going to get out $522,000, and this is based on math from a couple years ago. We're told this is substantially different today because if all of you have looked at medical inflation numbers, medical inflation has been running about double mean U.S. inflation. So there's a whole bunch of ugly recalculations that are going to be happening around this place as we try to figure out what we've done to ourselves in this inflation cycle. Spending on mandatory programs is expected to increase as a larger share of the population is in retirement age. Duh. But we still thought we'd make a nice slide out of it. Okay, Social Security right now is functionally a little over 5% of all the entire economy. The entire economy goes out, 5% of it in Social Security. In a couple decades, that goes to 5.7. So Social Security, okay, it's fixable. It's Medicare. Medicare today, now this is Medicare, not Medicaid, not Indian Health Services, not veterans, just Medicaid itself. Today, the spend on that is about 6.4% of the entire economy. The next couple of decades, it goes well over 8%. When we get into large numbers, we actually often use percentages of the entire economy. So if anyone's paying attention here, when we were talking about those earlier slides, that if we can maximize growth, because if we're doing percentages of the size of the economy, and you don't want to be putting out 8+% just in senior health care in the economy, grow the economy. And this number goes down. Change the price of health care by adopting technology, curing things. And the number of times I've come to this floor and talked about what we could do. Number one cost in society today is what? It's diabetes. 33% of all healthcare spending is diabetes. 31% of all Medicare is diabetes. If I came to you and said, what's the single thing you could do to maximize an impact on the budget, the debt, the borrowing, and also be one of the most moral things you could do in society? If you cared about income inequality for my tribal populations, and it's not income, my tribal populations, I represent the second highest per capita population in the world with their diabetes. But urban poor, rural poor, it turns out if you cared about income inequality, it's health. When we've been trying to do, and the economics, the math is really complex because there's so much noise in the numbers. As we say, noise in the data. But so many of my brothers and sisters on the left come in and say, it's racism, it's education. Well, it turns out the data may say it's actually health. As a moral society, why wouldn't we say, okay, there's things we can do. We know we could actually tomorrow revolutionize the farm bill to say we're going to take on obesity in our society because we're killing ourselves. We're not going to hand you an EBT card that you can go get onion rings with. And yes, there's lobbyists everywhere here who are now upset that I'm not selling their onion rings. Welcome to the world. Every time you tell the truth about this math, you have an army of lobbyists in the hallway who are mad at you because you may have taken away dollars from who they're representing. I care so much more about the survival and prosperity of this country. Okay, how about the next thing? Have you seen the over-the-skin? Matter of fact, I saw the article that a future Apple Watch is going to have a blood glucose meter in it. What would happen if you had our pre-diabetic populations who could actually watch what's happening to their body without pricking themselves? They can see it right there on their phone. Would that change society if you could stabilize the pre-diabetic population. Remember, diabetes is 33% of all healthcare spending. How about these GLP-1s? I have an article from University of Southern California, which I'm still upset they're moving to the Big Ten instead of the Pac-12, but that's a whole different discussion. Article basically says just the use of GLP-1s in Medicare, not Medicaid, Medicare populations would be $1 trillion. $1 trillion impact to the positive. We need to study that. Is that Republican or Democrat, or is it just giving a darn? And then I've come here a couple weeks ago when the company that has this incredible stem cell that they've actually tagged with CRISPR so the body doesn't want to rejection, so you don't have to have anti-rejection drugs, and it's in phase 1, that actually gets a body producing islet cells again, meaning your body produces insulin again. That may be at the end of the decade, but because of the way they're doing it, you could do it in a biofoundry fashion, which meaning you could have a production line. It doesn't have to be designed to you. Why wouldn't we, as we're doing the budget discussion and all these other things, set a decade vision saying we are going to stabilize pre-diabetic populations. We're going to help our brothers and sisters get healthy again. And dear heaven, if it works, at the end of the decade, we could actually have people who've wrecked parts of their body's system to actually start producing insulin again. And it would be worth trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of less borrowing. That's a vision. And this place is incapable, almost incapable of processing vision. But the reality is upon us. Annual spend for Medicare and Medicaid, and this number is already not enough. And by the end of the decade, it's functionally $1 trillion more annually. And the majority of that money will be borrowed. And I, in a weird way, wanted to close on this. We are still the shiny object in the industrialized world. We are still better off than people we compete with. We need to embrace that, but not lay on our laurels. We need to stop the stupid types of conversations we have here on the floor where we talk about the shiny object instead of the things that take down us as a republic, which is debt, which actually is our economics. And understand, this is what's called a dependency ratio. And it's not a derogatory term. It's an economic term of here's what I have in the labor market in a country, and here's how many people I have not in the labor market. It's not complex math. China. We hear the conversations about China, China, China. China's a problem. But China is on the verge of a collapse demographically. I'm one of those who believe much of what we see China doing is they're running around the world trying to build annuities because their one-child policies, all the other things they did, they are collapsing demographically. And they start to roll over in the next couple of years. I mean, where, boom, their working population is collapsing. Is that why you go out and buy ports and buy farmland and buy these things, as you're trying to turn the world into an annuity so you have cash flow? It's worth thinking about. But here's Japan. Excuse me, Japan's already way down here. And they actually sort of flatlined, but Japan has done incredibly creative things. Incentives for seniors saying, if you're healthy and you want to, we're going to make it advantageous if you want to stay in the labor forces. Adoption of technology, because, and they have incredibly high savings rates. They are able to finance much of their own debt. We don't. We have a society where the majority of our population is living paycheck to paycheck, substantially because of inflation. But we fall, but we don't fall nearly as hard. Our demographic curve is ugly, but it's so much less ugly than Western Europe, than Japan and China. And the reason we did these three countries, this is number one, number two, number three size economies in the world. If we get the most basic tax, regulatory, immigration, adoption of technology policies right here, this can be a hell of a great decade. It can be a hell of a great century. This could once again be another American century. But I will argue it will be the decisions made in this time frame, in this year and next year, because we are at the inflection. You see it demographically in the chart. We're at the time of inflection. Do we actually step up and use an IQ around here, or do we still sound like it's the 1990s politically? For everyone that's terrified of a chat AI, grow up. It could actually be one of the next generations of economic growth if you do it right. Embrace it, learn it, get it right, and run with it. The new stem cell therapies, the fact we might cure diabetes, the fact there's things we could do. Understand it, learn it, run with it. Fix this stupid immigration system. Close up our borders, stop importing poverty, bring in talent. There's just simple things. The tax code, get it so it incentivizes risk-taking and investment to grow. It's not, you don't need a PhD in this stuff. You may be required to be literate, and maybe that's a problem. And our running joke here is I work in a place that's a math-free zone. That was meant to be funny, but it's sort of sarcastic and cruel. I believe really, really good things can happen. You got to get the policies right. And my rage that I feel is I don't believe this place has even come close to actually having those pro-growth, those sort of growth is moral, what are we going to do type conversations, and then to turn it into policy. And I'm exhausted. I just don't know how to drag this place over the line so they actually think. And with that, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, I yield back.